Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear students. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, the Principal Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister of India, and the author of many very interesting books. The primary of them, which all of us know, is The Land of the Seven Rivers, The Ocean of Churn, and now the new book, The Revolutionaries. It is indeed a pleasure to have him here in Rajapalayam, which he has, with his wife Smita, have consented to come here. Thank you very much for taking your time to be here. Our association with Mr. Sanyal began many years ago when my wife Nirmala requested him to discuss his then new book, The Land of the Seven Rivers, and she wanted him to address the students about those books. And he very graciously agreed to talk about that and really inspired the students. And that book is still used in the school after so many years. So thank you very much, Mr. Sanyal. Since then, we have kept in close touch and have learnt a lot from our association with him and from his vast treasure of knowledge. We are here present here today to hear him talk about the revolutionaries, the other story of how India won its freedom. This is an inspiring book about how, apart from the powerful Gandhian movement of Satyagraha, which he fought for our freedom, a network of patriots fought for our freedom and persisted through active resistance. His talk is always very inspiring, and I invite him to give us his story now. Before that, we will start with a short video, and the significance of which Mr. Sanya will now explain. Thank you.
Vande Mataram.
शरीरे बाहुते तुमी मा शक्ति हृदये तुमी मा भक्ति बाहुते तुमी मा शक्ति हृदये तुमी मा भक्ति तुम्हार प्रतिमा गड़े मंदिरे
So, good afternoon, friends. I know the audience today, and it's wonderful to see all of you. There are students here, there are teachers here, there are prominent citizens of the town. So, thank you very much all for making time for coming to listen to me today. Before I give my main lecture, let me explain to you the significance of the song that you just heard being played out. You all know of the national song Vande Mataram. When you listen to the Vande Mataram, you are probably taught that at school as well. It is the first two stanzas that you are taught, and that is the national song. But it's a longer song which has a third, fourth, and fifth stanza as well. And what was played here was the third and fourth stanza, and the importance of that is that this is the segment that was very often sung by revolutionaries who had fought against British rule. This is the bit that they would sing as they went to the gallows when they would be hanged. So you heard the part that is in many, many ways the most significant part of that song when they would sing that, and I'll explain very briefly what it means. It basically says, "Oh mother, why do they call you to be defenseless when there are a million voices screaming out your name, when there are a million hands standing up to defend you? For you are our dharma, you are our love and spirit that animates us. You are the goddess that we worship in our temples." So that is very briefly what the meaning of those lines are. And this is a song that inspired a very different resistance to British rule than what we are very often told about. So when you read the history of the freedom struggle, most of you will be taught about in the schools and official textbooks about the non-violent movement against British rule, led at least in the latter decades by Mahatma Gandhi. But there was another source of resistance to the British, and that was of armed resistance, of violent resistance against the British. Now, you may get the impression from the official line that we somehow gently suggested to the British that they should leave, and they politely left. But when you hear the story of the armed resistance, you get a very different image of what actually happened. And what I'm going to tell you is the story of that resistance. Now, of course, many of you may be aware that there had been armed resistance to the British right from the beginning, going back to the 18th century, right through the 19th century. In fact, many of those events happened right here where you are, in and around Rajapalayam. You may know about the Polygar revolt, for example, and many other events. But by 1857, most of the traditional elites of the country were exhausted. Basically, with the revolt of 1857, the British had defeated all existing groups and sources of resistance. And although there were the occasional acts of resistance, for example, you had the Manipuris nobility that revolted in the 1890, or some of the tribal revolts, for example, led by Birsa Munda and so on, they were not really threats to the British rule. So what happens at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century is that a completely new group of people rise up against the British. And this is the group that I have written the book about. So my book is not about the longer resistance to British rule through armed resistance, but of this group called the revolutionaries starting around about 1900. Now it is very interesting what happens is that at that time there was a lot of other movements around the world that were also bubbling up. There were the Irish who were revolting against British rule. There were the Japanese who in 1905 defeated the Russians. This was the first time that an Asian power had defeated a European power. And it was a very big deal, 1905. Italy had got reunified by overthrowing the foreign rulers like the Austrians who ruled over them. And so one of the great inspirations of that time was Mazzini and Garibaldi. Again, not many people know that the Italian independence movement was a big inspiration to the Indian freedom movement, much forgotten. Just like the Irish were an inspiration, the Italians were also an inspiration. And in the middle of all of that, there is also all kinds of Hindu revival movements that were happening. There were, for example, in Punjab, the Arya Samaj. In Bengal, there was Shri Aurobindo, and before him, Vivekanand. In Maharashtra, there was Tilak. Now you all know about the Ganpati Puja that happens in Bombay. It's a very big deal all over Maharashtra. Now it happens in many other parts of the country as well. But this puja was actually originally a relatively small event that used to happen in people's homes. Maybe earlier times it had been a big puja, but certainly by the 1890s, this was a very small scale puja that used to happen. So it was Bal Gangadhar Tilak who used this puja to essentially turned it into a major public event as a way of gathering large crowds who you could then give speeches about the need for Indian freedom. Now, this is the context in which a new phase of armed resistance arose. And this is the movement that is called the revolutionary movement. Now, it is not the case that you will not have heard some of these names. I'm sure all of you have heard of Subhash Bose or of Bhagat Singh or of Chandrasekhar Azad and so on. Some of the names, there are many others. So it's not that they have been forgotten. Unfortunately, the way history was written after independence gives you the impression that the resistance of these individuals was just sporadic acts of heroism, but didn't actually add up anything greater. But as I will show you, this is not the case. The revolutionaries were a very large and significant movement involving tens of thousands of people. They had networks not only across India, but also outside India, in places like Germany, in Japan, in North America, in Singapore. And using these networks, they were able to put up half a century of resistance against the largest empire in the world. And many of those who were doing this, by the way, it is important to remember, were people who were very, very young. They were people, most of them were in their 20s, a few of them were in their late teens. So do remember that when Bhagat Singh was hanged, he was only 23 years old. So many of these people, what were they doing? So let me tell you their story. So in the first decade of the 20th century, which is the 1900s, two important characters began to come up with the idea that, look, our ancestors had put up with such a resistance for an invasion. So they looked back and they saw people like Shivaji, who also was leading a very small group of people against what was then one of the greatest empires in the world, the Mughal Empire. They looked back at Rana Pratap, and they looked back even further back to the times of Chanakya and his resistance against the Greeks and so on. And they said, we can also do it. And so, in the 1900s, there was one person called Aurobindo Ghosh, who you may now know as Shri Aurobindo, but at that time he was not known as a saint and a hermit, but as Aurobindo Ghosh. And he was working in a princely state called Baroda. And another person called Veer Savarkar, or Vinayak Savarkar, who was studying, he was a young student in his early 20s, studying in London. And the two of them began to write out these, what we would call quite incendiary writings, which began to circulate among the youth of that time. So just to give you some sense of this, Aurobindo Ghosh wrote, he used to write a series of pamphlets, and then later on he left this job with the king of Baroda and he moved to Kolkata, and he would write in a newsletter called Bande Mataram. And this letter began to circulate all over India. Similarly, Savarkar was sitting in London and he was giving talks, and there were a lot of Indian students then in Europe, both in London and in Paris, and he began to contact them. And what happened is that this group of people began to rapidly organize into a network of akhadas. So you know what an akhada is? It's a gymnasium, small. So a network of akhadas began to pop up all across India and some of them across the world. Now the British figured out that there was something going on wrong and they began to tail these people. So in London you have Scotland Yard policemen in plain clothes trying to find out what Savarkar is up to. And in India, in Kolkata, you have plain clothes people trying to find out what Aurobindo and his brother Barin are up to. Now, what happens is that one of Savarkar's followers goes and assassinates somebody called Curzon Wiley in London. And here in Kolkata, Aurobindo Ghosh's group, which is called the Anushilan Samiti, goes and also carries out a bunch of assassinations of senior officials. So not surprisingly, there is a huge amount of pressure to hunt them down. So they hunt them down and Savarkar is arrested. He tries to escape from the ship. He dives off the ship, but they manage to get him back and they send him off to Kalapani. As you know, it's a cellular jail in Andamans. And similarly, Shri Aurobindo is arrested. He manages to win the case, but his brother and all the followers are also sent off to Kalapani. Some of them are hanged. So now, this first generation of the movement basically doesn't come to very much. But meanwhile, what has happened, all their writings are circulating everywhere. They are circulating in India and they are circulating abroad. So a new generation of revolutionaries begins to pop up. And their leader is somebody called Raj Bihari Bose. Not many people remember Raj Bihari Bose, but he's an extremely important character. And he does something quite interesting. He used to, at that time, work in Dehradun in the Forest Research Institute as a technician and a clerk and a head clerk. So, in 1911, as many of you may know, the British shifted the Indian capital from Kolkata to Delhi. So in 1912, finally the official, after the announcement, a year after the announcement, the Viceroy turned up in what was then the main city, Old Delhi. And they decided that they were going to take this big procession through the middle of the city on an elephant to essentially establish that the British now ruled India and they ruled from Delhi because that had been the original capital. So in that sense, they were legitimizing their rule for the long run. So Raj Bihari Bose and another young man, Basanta Bishwas, they hide in one of the buildings on Chandni Chowk where the procession was going. And they throw a bomb on Viceroy Hardinge and almost kill him. The bomb bursts, his attendant dies, Viceroy Hardinge is very badly hurt, he nearly dies. And Raj Bihari Bose and Basanta Biswas escape from there. Raj Bihari goes off to Dehradun, and he's quite a cheeky fellow. What he does is, as soon as he reaches Dehradun, of course, he's the first person with the news that such an attack had happened on Hardinge. So he organizes a big group like this, and he firmly condemns the attack on the Viceroy. The British are so taken aback by this vehemence of his loyalty to the British Empire, that when a few months later, Viceroy Hardinge comes to Dehradun, they make Raj Bihari Bose the head of the welcoming party. But this is not the end of it. Meanwhile, remember, we have reached 1913, 1914, and the First World War starts. So now Raj Bihari Bose decides that here is an opportunity to throw off the shackles of British rule. And how are they going to do it? They are going to infiltrate the British Indian Army and try and cause a revolt. So he teams up with another remarkable young man called Sachindranath Sanyal, and they begin to send out emissaries to all these Indian regiments across the country, but even some outside of India, and tell them that on a particular day in February 1915, they are all going to revolt. So it's all set up, and it looks like they were going to succeed in creating, just like in 1857, a grand revolt in the Indian Army. Unfortunately, just 2 days before this big revolt was supposed to take place, a traitor switches sides and informs the British that this revolt is going to happen. So this big revolt called the Gadar revolt nearly takes place. But just 2 days before that, somebody informs the British, across India, in front of all the armories, the Indian guards are shifted and European guards are put in charge. So this revolt never happens, except in Singapore, where they haven't heard, the Indian troops there didn't know that the revolt hadn't happened in India. So this revolt happens in Singapore. For a full week, the Indian regiments based in Singapore hold Singapore. And ultimately, of course, they are overpowered. So this is a case where we nearly managed to cause a revolt and became free in 1950. Not many people will know this, but it was a very, very close thing. But Raj Bihari now knows that he's in trouble. So he now escapes to Japan. Sachin Sanyal is captured and he's sent off to Kalapani as well. But Raj Bihari hasn't given up. So he goes to Japan and he begins to talk to the Germans. Remember, the Germans and the Turks were fighting against the French and the British in the First World War. So Raj Bihari Bose then contacts a whole bunch of Indian nationalists living in North America called the Gadarites. So most of them were Sikhs. And so they were led by a disciple of Savarkar called Lala Hardayal. So they contact, and what they do is, with German help, they manage to buy 30,000 rifles. So not a small amount. And they get hold of a ship and they try to sail this ship and land these rifles on the coast of Odisha, where there is a person called Bagha Jotin who was waiting for it. So the idea was you would land all these 30,000 rifles, spread it around, and of course the British were very preoccupied with the war. So they wouldn't know what happened, and suddenly with the 30,000 soldiers across India, the British wouldn't be able to control it. That was the idea. Again, unfortunately, the German agent who was supposed to manage this, because the ships had to come, they had bought the guns in North America, they had to come through in what is now Indonesia, which was then called the Dutch Indies, East Indies, and make its way to the Indian Ocean. So the German agent who was supposed to carry out this operation unfortunately switches sides and he informs the British. So this consignment is captured and a large team of policemen are sent to Odisha to hunt down Bagha Jotin, who does not know that this consignment has been captured. So he's waiting there on the coast when he suddenly finds all these troops in this area and there's a big gunfight, and he also gets killed off. Now, meanwhile, what is happening? The Germans and the Turks now fund another attempt. So they fund a bunch of people led by somebody called Pandurang Khankoji, and they form an army of Indian revolutionaries and also Persian irregular tribesmen and so on, and they try to invade India from Iran, what is now Iran, then called Persia, through Balochistan into India. And they also try to get the ruler of Afghanistan to join this war. So Pandurang Khankoji ends up in eastern Iran with an army of about 5,000. And the British realize what is happening and they also send out troops to meet them. Now guess who led this group of people to meet Pandurang Khankoji? It was a brigadier called Brigadier Reginald Dyer. Do you know this name? Reginald Dyer, have you heard this name? He's the person who would later on carry out the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. But he originally made his name fighting with Pandurang Khankoji on the Balochistan-Iran border. Now, while all of this is going on, of course, the war ends with the Germans and the Turks losing and the Allies winning. So the war ends. Pandurang Khankoji, now many of these people are now either jailed or killed and so on. But Pandurang Khankoji is stuck. So he escapes along with many others to Russia, and then he would personally go off to Mexico. Now, you would think that battle had been won by the British. But actually the British are even more scared than before. Why? Because now all the regiments, Indian regiments, are coming back to India. Remember, all these Indian regiments, this is 1919, all these regiments had in 1915, they had almost revolted. So now the British are thinking, okay, they were fine when we had sent them to Europe and fighting, etc. is fine, but now they will come back to India, they'll be together, and they are all radicalized. And by the way, very importantly for the time, because they were fighting the Germans, they have lost the fear of killing the white man. So they are even more dangerous than they were before. And they are particularly dangerous in Maharashtra, but even more so in Punjab. That's where a lot of these soldiers came from. That's where the recruitment grounds were, although they were there from all parts of the country. So the British are now afraid that there will be a massive revolt in India with these troops coming back. And meanwhile, what they are also afraid is all these networks of Indians across the world are also going to revolt. They are particularly scared of the Sikhs who were living in North America and Canada. And they used to function through a network of Gurudwaras. So what happens is, they send an agent called Hopkinson to try and infiltrate all the Gurudwaras and split the Hindus from the Sikhs. Because earlier the Sikhs did not consider themselves separate from the Hindus. But they try to split them. And there are, of course, the nationalist Gadarite Sikhs in those Gurudwaras know what's going on, but they are also on this other side collaborators. So what happens is that there are these gunfights in the Gurudwaras in Canada. And some of those gunfights happen in courtroom where in fact a Gadarite Sikh called Mewa Singh pulls out a revolver and shoots Hopkinson dead in the court. And many of these others are shot dead. But the British would continue to infiltrate the Gurudwaras. And if you are wondering why the Khalistani movement even today functions out of Canada, that's because they are the remnants of this movement, of this British operation in 100 years ago. Now, meanwhile, all these troops are coming back to India. So what do the British do? They introduce something called the Rowlatt Acts. These are draconian acts by which the British authorities could simply capture whoever they wanted and jail them without really having to prove why they had put them in jail. So these very draconian acts are there, and there are lots of protests happening all across India. But of course, because a lot of it is directed towards these Punjabi Sikh soldiers coming back, a lot of those agitations happen in Punjab. And all of this ultimately culminates, as you know, with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. I'm telling you all of this so that you understand that why did the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happen? It happened because the British were very scared of a major revolt was brewing, and they had created these laws. And unless you understand the Gadarites and the revolutionaries, you do not understand their response. It is also the reason they had sent Reginald Dyer to carry out that suppression, because he had earlier been fighting with the same revolutionary groups. That's why he was there. Now, of course, this happens, and what happens as a result of which there is a big massacre, there's a big scandal all around the world. This causes a lot of dissension. So ultimately, the British are forced to become more conciliatory, and they release some of the revolutionaries from Kalapani. Now many of these revolutionaries now begin to come back to India. Of course, as you know, Kalapani was perhaps hell on earth. I mean, all of them were subjected to daily torture in multiple ways, and if you read my book, I have talked about how they were tortured. But it's quite extraordinary that when of these revolutionaries, after so many years of torture, came back to India, one of the first things they did was to go back to the revolutionary activity. They had clearly not been scared by all the torturing. And one of those was a gentleman called Sachin Sanyal, which we will remember from before. Now, Sachin Sanyal now begins to put together all these different groups together. While he is doing this, however, Mahatma Gandhi is leading the non-cooperation movement. And in the 1920s, 1921, The non-cooperation movement is taking place all over India. It must have happened here as well. And it seems like the British are going to be forced out. But then suddenly, after an incident which you will know about called Chauri Chaura, Gandhiji suddenly pulled back the movement. At this point, many of the revolutionaries who had joined the non-cooperation movement, they became very disillusioned. So they wandered off, and Sachindranath Sanyal began to organize them into another round of resistance to the British. So all these old Anushilan Samiti groups were floating around the country. He puts them together under an umbrella organization called the Hindustan Republican Association, and under it he built something called the Hindustan Republican Army. Now the name is not coincidental, because the Hindustan Republican Army is actually named after the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. So this is an interesting fact. And then he writes a constitution for the HRA. And the constitution is very interesting because it is the first mention of India as a democratic republic with full universal voting rights. Now you have to remember why this is significant, because he is doing this in 1923. In 1923, the Congress was not demanding for full freedom. It was demanding for dominion status, which is that the king would still continue to rule India, just Indians would have a little bit more rights. So it is the revolutionaries who were the first to articulate that India should be a democratic republic. Before anyone else, it is they said that. They also said that India should have universal suffrage, that is, everybody should have a vote. Remember, this is a time in which even in Britain, the women did not have the right to vote. So they were very progressive and forward-looking in their view. So it is during these early 20s that Sachin Sanyal began to recruit more and more people. So he goes and recruits Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Ashfaqullah Khan, Bismil, many others, and they now begin to do all kinds of activities. Now they have a problem, that while their network is growing, but they don't have any guns, because every attempt to bring guns, if you remember, in the First World War had failed. So they don't have any guns. So what they do is they send they find a swimmer, a good swimmer, Indian swimmer, and send him for a tournament in Germany. And they give him a actual secret job, was to go to this tournament, but his actual job was to go to Stuttgart and acquire guns and ammunition. And so he signs a treaty, and they say, okay, how are we going to send it? They say, okay, we'll send it by a consignment to the Bay of Bengal, and then in international waters, we will send you fishing boats and we will take the guns. So they do all of that. So this is what they're doing in circa 1924-25. Now there is a problem. How do you pay for this? So they decide that they will rob a train which was carrying government revenue, so significant monies. So they raid a train near Lucknow in a place called Kakodi, which they raid and they rob it. Unfortunately, the problem is that they forget that the notes that they steal, it has got its numberings in it. So when they begin to spend the money, the British are able to trace where the money comes from, and they manage to trace back to the revolutionaries. And there's a big hunt, and many of this generation of revolutionaries is again captured. Some are hanged. Ashfaqullah, Bismil, and so on are hanged. And Sachin Sanyal yet again is sent back to Kalapani for another 10 years. Now what happens is you have decimated another generation. So you remember one generation was Savarkar and Aurobindo. They got wiped out, and Aurobindo eventually escaped to Pondicherry. There was another generation which happened during the Gadar movement, and then Rashbihari escaped, and many of the others got killed. Now, Kakodi case, another bunch get killed. Now, another new generation of leaders arise. Now, this generation is very, very young, because remember, so many new leaders have been killed off, right? So now, this is the generation where you have Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, and so on, who come to the fore. And they then lead a round of resistance to the British. They carry out many activities and so on. But And by around about 1930, they are doing many things. For example, in Chittagong, which is now in Bangladesh, they carry out a huge raid on the armory there, and they steal guns and do many things, and they hold the city for a little while, for a few days, and so on. So there are suddenly, all over the country, there are, even here in Tamil Nadu, there is an assassination of a district magistrate not far from here, and across the country, all of this is going on. Various people are getting, British officials are getting targeted. There is, of course, at the side, there's also the non-violent movement of Satyagraha, etc. going. So this whole thing is building up. So the British decide to, in the early 30s, to carry out another round of repression. And many of this generation also get killed off. And as you will know, Bhagat Singh is hanged in Lahore. You have Chandrasekhar Azad, who is trapped in Prayag, what is then called Allahabad, in a park where there's a gunfight and he's finally killed off, and so on and so forth. Now, by around about 1933, both the peaceful movement and the armed resistance, both of them are exhausted. They have fought and fought and fought, and India is still not free. So there is a period in the mid-30s where both sides are just too exhausted to do anything. But then what happens is that towards the end of the 30s, a new sort of momentum comes up. This happens because the revolutionaries smell that there's going to be a war in Europe again. So there is another opportunity to carry out a revolt in the Indian army. Now meanwhile, Sachin Sanyal has been released from Kalapani, and he comes back to India after 10 whole years in Kalapani. Second time, 10 years. But he is clearly not reformed, because the first thing he does as soon as he comes back is he again makes contact with all the regiments. And he also makes contact now with Subhash Bose, who used to be in the Congress, had long links with the revolutionaries, but now, after having been pushed out of the Congress presidency, had now become much more explicit about and open about his links to the revolutionaries. And Sachin Sanyal and Subhash Bose now contact, remember Raj Bihari Bose, who had run away during the Ghadar movement to Japan? They contact Raj Bihari Bose, and they then begin to operate that, look, now there's going to be another war. This time, we are definitely going to cause a revolt in the Indian army. Now the war starts. The British are very well aware that what these revolutionaries are up to. So they capture Sachin Sanyal and put him back in jail. They also capture Subhash Bose. They put him in jail, but he goes on a hunger strike and says, release me and let me go back to So they let him go home to his house in Elgin Road in Kolkata, where he is put on house arrest. But Subhash Bose has no intentions of staying there. So one night, he dresses himself as a Muslim Maulana and escapes from Calcutta, makes his way through train into Afghanistan. Ultimately, from Afghanistan, he escapes with the help of the Italian embassy into Russia, and from there he makes his way to Berlin, where he asks the Germans for help. The problem is that although Hitler was fighting the British, he was actually quite an admirer of the British Empire. So although he keeps him there as a potential useful tool, Hitler is not very keen to help the Indians gain freedom from the British. He was basically a racist. The last thing he wanted is for non-white people to rise and revolt. He would much rather want to make a deal with the British that you keep your empire, we just want to build our own empire, what's the problem? So that was the problem. So Subhash Bose is sitting in Germany, doesn't know what to do because he knows now that Hitler is not going to help him. But his luck changes because Japan suddenly enters the war, and all of a sudden it captures basically much of Asia, Southeast Asia, and particularly Singapore. And in Singapore, there is a significant Indian regiment. So when the Indian regiments in Singapore and Malaya, they surrender, Raj Bihari Bose convinces the Japanese to used these surrendered soldiers to create an army of liberation for India called the Indian National Army, INA, or in Hindi you can call it the Azad Hind Fauj. Now this is important to remember. It is not Netaji who founded the INA. It was Rash Bihari Bose. And it was not his first attempt. He had been attempting to do this from the First World War. So finally, in 1942-43, he succeeds and creates an INA. But there is a problem, because by this time, Rash Bihari Bose was a very old man. Remember, he had been doing this in the First World War, and we are now in the middle of the Second World War. So he realizes that he just doesn't have the health to carry on. So it is he who then asks the Japanese to request the Germans to provide Netaji. So that is how Subhash Bose gets into a submarine from Germany, makes his way to the Indian Ocean, switches to a Japanese submarine, who then takes him to Singapore. And that's how Subhash Bose came to take over the leadership from Rash Bihari Bose of the Indian National Army. But of course, they had to expand the size of this army. So they have these regiments that they had already got because they had surrendered. But Netaji is a very charismatic person, as you may realize. So he reaches out to a significant Indian community that lived in those parts. Most of it, they were, by the way, Tamil, there's still a large Tamil community in Singapore and Malaysia. So almost the entire Tamil community of that part of the world then rallied around Subhash Bose. They provided money, they provided people, many women signed up, so much so they actually created a Rani of Jhansi regiment for the women. And then they joined the march of the Japanese into Burma, and then they made it all the way through to Manipur and Nagaland. So, for the first time, Indian armies marched along with the Japanese and liberated parts of Manipur and Nagaland. They reached a town called Moirang, where the Indian flag was raised. Similarly, there were villages in Nagaland where the Indian flag was raised. And of course, they had also taken over the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which, remember, is of great symbolic value, given that many of the revolutionaries used to be kept there in prison in cellular jail. So you have a very famous picture of Netaji standing in front of the cellular jail, saluting an Indian flag. So finally, the revolutionaries had managed to do what they had been trying to do for so long, which was to cause a revolt in the Indian army. And unfortunately, by the time they managed to get to Manipur and Nagaland, the tide of the battle of the Second World War had already begun to turn, unfortunately. The Germans had been defeated in Stalingrad and were withdrawing. The Japanese had been defeated in the Battle of Midway in the Pacific, and they were withdrawing. And so the momentum was completely lost. By 1944, the whole thing began to unwind, and of course, as you know, the war ended in 1945 with the Allies again winning. Now you may think that, that was the end of the revolutionaries. But no. This is where the story gets even more interesting. What happens is that the war ends in August 1945. And by the end of the year, all the European, Australian, American soldiers all want to go home. They have been at war for many years. They're not professional soldiers, most of them. Most of them happen to be, they are carpenters, doctors, engineers, all kinds of other professions which they have left to join the war. They want to go back home to their families and so on. So they all begin to go back home. So the only soldiers left behind holding much of these areas that had been liberated from the Axis powers are actually Indian soldiers. So it's the British Indian Army that holds Egypt, it holds much of the Middle East, it holds, of course, India, it holds Burma, Malaya, it also holds Indonesia. which used to be the Dutch East Indies and had been conquered by the Japanese, but now the Dutch ran away, so now it's the British Indian Army that holds it. They also hold southern Vietnam. So from southern Vietnam to Egypt, the main armed force that held it all together was the British Indian Army. Now, as you can imagine, at this point, having a revolt in the British Indian Army was a very big deal, because if it happened, not only would the British lose India, they would also lose their entire empire across. So this is the point at which the British make a big mistake. They carry out the INA trials. So they bring all the officers of the British, of the INA to the Red Fort, and they begin to carry out the trials. And do remember that if it was proved that they were guilty of rebellion, which they would have been, of treason, which is what they would have been accused of, many of them would be essentially hanged. So this is a death sentence if they are found to be guilty. So this is the context in which these trials happen. Unfortunately for them, this is a bad strategic mistake on the part of the British, because till this point, most Indians actually did not know about the INA. Remember, there had been wartime censorship. So they knew that maybe Subhash Bose had escaped. They probably vaguely heard that something he had done with the Japanese. But the fact that there was this large army of liberation that had reached India, it had reached the borders of India, that is for the very first time heard by the Indians. And this is not just by the average Indian, but also by the soldiers of the British Indian Army. So there is a buzz everywhere. And suddenly the British Indian soldiers are beginning to become restless. They're also restless because you have put them in all these vague places. So they are naturally, the locals in those countries are also on to liberate themselves. So in Egypt, they are revolting and the Indian soldiers are sent out to shoot the Egyptians. There is a huge revolt in Indonesia, where the Japanese, when they were surrendering, and handed all their guns before surrendering to the local Indonesians, and the Indonesians began to now shoot at the occupying force, which was British Indian forces. And there's a big fight in Surabaya in which thousands of Indonesians are killed, but hundreds of Indians are also killed. So now the Indian soldiers are thinking, it's one thing to defend your own empire. Now you're sending us up to defend somebody else's empire, Dutch empire, French empire, whoever is your friend. Our lives don't mean anything. So this is the context in which there's lots of murmurings of revolt. Now back in India, this revolt also begins to affect the navy. And a group of revolutionaries infiltrate the navy. And in February 1946, there is a massive rebellion in the Royal Indian Navy in Mumbai, or what was then called Bombay. And it's not a small affair. There's 20,000 sailors, and they're veterans, remember, so they're not rookies. These are people who fought a war just a few months earlier. 20,000 Royal Indian Navy sailors go on revolt. They capture almost 80 ships in the harbor of Bombay, and they basically now threaten to take over the city. So again, the British call in the Maratha regiment to shoot at them. So the Maratha regiment turns up, and it looks like, so on one side there are the navy with their guns and everything, on the other side the Maratha regiment, and the British ask the Maratha regiment to fire. When they fire, they keep firing, but then after a little while the British commanders realize there's something odd happening. The Marathas are clearly, purposely not shooting at any target. They're missing all the time. So they realize that this is a dangerous situation. So they call in the Royal Indian Air Force to bomb the ships. And suddenly all the Royal Indian Air Force aircraft develop engine trouble. So this is the point at which the British realize that they cannot control India. So it was during the Great Naval Revolt of 1946 that Prime Minister Attlee finally announces the committee to decide Indian independence. So you can see, when the story is told from the perspective of the revolutionaries, it is a very different story of how India became free. I'm not making the case here that the peaceful movement did not have any role. It did have a role. But I just want to show you how, if you saw the story from the perspective of the revolutionaries, it is a very different story to how we became free. It is also an important part of our story, and I hope I have been able to tell you in a very short while a gist of that movement. The longer story is there in my book. You're all welcome to read it. But with that, let me stop and let me say I'm open to questions.
Good evening, sir. I don't have a question, but I have some doubt. Then I read your book, Revolutionary. You gave more information about unsung freedom fighters like us, Chandrasekhar Azad, Ram Prasad Bismil, Surya Sen, etc. But how to expose the history of unsung heroes among our society or our people, sir? How to expose the history of unsung heroes among our people?
So, obviously, this is one book.
Yes.
Not every possible person is in that book. It's a book. I had to keep it to a length where I can, people will read it. If I make it a very fat book, nobody will read it.
Is it possible to include in the curriculum of school and college education about the revolutionaries and the revolutionary movement? What is your opinion, sir?
Absolutely is possible.
Yes.
Again, as I said, this is a very long history, and while it is not possible to have every bit of it in the history book, in your school curriculum, I do think, however, it is important to include some of it. Unfortunately, what happens today is, first of all, very few of them are named. I think basically Netaji is named and nobody else. And even if you do hear about one or two others, sometimes like Bhagat Singh, you get the impression that, they did some individual act of bravery, and that was more or less the end of the matter. What I've tried to do through this talk and through the book is not so much focus on individual characters, but to show you that this was a long, unified movement that went over half a century, involving hundreds and tens of thousands of people, in fact. That was the basic point, to give you a flavor of what it is. And yes, it is possible to put at least part of this story into textbooks. Yes?
Okay. Then one more question, sir. Then why South Indian freedom fighters are not highlighted compared to other Indian freedom struggles, sir?
So this story is important, that you have to know that this book is about the revolutionary movement specifically. It is not about the full freedom struggle. If I had included the earlier period, for example, I would have talked about the polygars. But this book does not deal with that period. This deals with the period 1900 to 1946. And in that period, the bulk of the revolutionaries did come from three provinces: Bengal, Maharashtra, and Punjab. So you will find a disproportionate number of people from those three provinces. Nonetheless, the book does mention some people from southern India, for example, VVS Iyer. So the interesting thing is, although not too many of the revolutionary activities happened in South India, there were many South Indians who were involved, but their activities happened outside of India. For example, I give you the example of VVS Iyer. VVS Iyer was Savarkar's right-hand man in London House, in India House in London. There are many others as well. I mentioned very large numbers of Tamils living in Southeast Asia were a part of Netaji's army. There is, of course, the story of Alluri Sitarama Raju, who I mentioned in the book. There is a segment on it.
In Andhra Pradesh.
Yeah, and again, unsung hero, until I think this movie RRR, I think most people didn't even know he existed. So at least he has been brought to the fore. But let me also confirm, there is no evidence that he went dancing in the governor's house.
Then one more question, sir.
So I think now you'll have to allow a few other questions to others. Yeah, thank you.
And Namaste, Sanyal ji. I have two questions. I'm very curious to know. You're both an economist and a historian. But if you were given a choice between these two, which one would you choose? Which one would you prefer more? And the next question is, what inspired you to become a historian? Is it because that you belong to a family of revolutionary freedom fighters that you took up history, or is it because of the love for history that inspired you?
Okay, very complicated question to answer. I can't say I'm specially attracted to either economics or history writing, or I, by the way, write other things other than history as well. I have many of my books. I have nothing. I even write fiction, by the way, if you have to read my fiction books. But let me say that I don't really separate these various activities in my head. Many of them flow into each other. So economics affects history, history affects geography, geography affects other culture. So in my head, they are not as well segregated as may be the case. And that should be in some ways, that is true of life. We may separate them into subjects for pedagogical reasons of teaching, but when you live life, you live them all mixed up. I mean, your economic life and your cultural life and your family life or your recreational life all flow into each other. So it's the same thing inside my head. So are they separated out? No. But specifically, if you're asking why I was interested in the story of the revolutionaries, well, yes, it is partly true that I was interested in it because both my mother's and my father's family were very much involved in this freedom struggle. So you will find people like Sachindranath Sanyal, who I mentioned several times, Bhupendranath Sanyal, Jatindranath Sanyal, Rabindranath Sanyal, Rajendra Lahiri. These are all my granduncles from my father's side. But I also have from my mother's side, but also revolutionaries. So they are also Sanyals, not related to each other, despite the fact that they share a surname. My mother's family are also Sanyals. So there is Nalinaksha Sanyal, who was my great-grandfather from my mother's side, his brothers, and so on, who were also revolutionaries. So yes, some part of my interest is in this, but I will not say I grew up thinking, oh, I'm going to write a book on revolutionaries. No. I had heard these stories, like many of you may have heard stories about your own grandparents. Some of them may have also participated in the freedom struggle in various ways. So I also grew up with them without any specific interest in them other than in a general sense. So it's only about 10 years ago that I began to feel that there was something odd about this story of our freedom struggle, that it didn't quite add up. There were many things I would somehow bump into that didn't seem to play a role. I'll give you one example. In the story I just told you, the great naval revolt of 1946 has a very important role in how India became free. And yet, into my 20s, I had never heard of the great naval revolt of 1946. I'll be very surprised, if there are many people in this hall who have never heard of 1946 naval revolt, because it's not there in our textbooks anywhere. And yet it is the critical event that led to Indian freedom. And I only found out about it because I was living in Bombay in the late 90s, and I happened to be wandering around in Kolaba, and I found a very small memorial to this movement, and I asked around, and nobody seemed to know anything much about it. Yes, there was some naval revolt, something. So thanks to Google, much later, of universities and so on, so I began reading more about this naval revolt, and suddenly it occurred to me, oh my God, this was a very major event, but we had never been told about it. Then I began to read my Sachin Sanyal's autobiography called Bandi Jeevan, which literally means life in prison. Again, it's written in Hindi and Bengali, and I was reading it, and suddenly, even though he is my granduncle, doesn't mean that you have read his book. It just happened to be there was a copy at home, and I began reading it. So finally, there were many characters in that which I had never heard of. Who are these people? Why he seems to think they are important, but why does he think they are important? Who are they? So again, thanks to Google, I began to look, who are these people? And then slowly a very different picture of how India became free began to emerge. And at some point I said, I began to travel to those places. So I went to Cellular Jail in Andamans. I went to Amritsar to see where the Jallianwala Bagh massacre had happened. I went to Mumbai, asked the Navy for special permission to see where the revolt had happened. I went to see where Savarkar had done. In London I went and I saw where Savarkar had lived, where Udham Singh, you may have heard of Udham Singh, had carried out, he had assassinated O'Dwyer, who was the governor of Punjab during the time of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So he avenged Jallianwala Bagh massacre 20 years after the massacre had happened. So where all those events had happened, I began to go and investigate. And slowly, as I said, a completely different picture emerged in my head, and I have tried to put that down on paper in this book. Thank you.
So good evening, sir. My
Yeah.
question is, your book is all about the freedom stories, and when we discuss about that, the youngsters of those days or the main reason for the liberty what we enjoying today. So do you think the same determination still remains alive among the youngsters nowadays?
It can remain alive. It is, I'm sure, somewhere in there that is alive, yes. But every generation has to pass on that flame to the next generation. The reason I'm doing this, writing this book and coming here and speaking to you is because that flame will only burn if one generation passes on the stories of the previous generation to the next one. That is what keeps the flame alive, right? Then you will know why you enjoy the benefits of freedom, which a previous generation before that had not. So that is why I'm here, to tell you that, look, you happen to live at a particular period in Indian history, which is very lucky, that after many about hundreds of years, about maybe 800 years or something like that, we are seeing an India that is really coming up. We are finally breaking out of our mental bondage of colonial imposition. And since you are going through this renaissance in India today, you are suddenly seeing India emerge finally as a major global power after hundreds of years, sometimes you may take it for granted. So it is important that I tell you these stories so that you understand why is it we do what we do, the way we are, why our ancestors did certain things in a particular way. So just to give you another example of this thing that you can do in your own life, I know that this particular area was very much involved in the Polygar revolt. And this morning I found a researcher from your town, he's sitting right here, who gave me a book about this Polygar revolt. Now I'll tell you again, this is another great story, which is not widely told. So it is up to you, he has now done the research, now it is up to you, maybe you can take it up to take this story, and there must be other stories as well. To begin to go and investigate them, you have to write authentic. This is not about creating fictional stories. You have to do the authentic research. But having done the authentic research, you have to go and tell these stories so that the memories of these times are kept alive. So that is what I'm trying to do through these books. So for example, in the specific case of the Polygars, I believe just 80 kilometers from here, there is a fort. Now nobody knows about this fort, it's just about lying around there. But maybe we can turn it into a national monument. We can celebrate it much more. So all I'm trying to say here is that it's not as if this is just about telling the story once. It has to be told, every generation has to tell the story to the next generation in a fresh way so that it makes sense to them. So I am trying to tell this story in my own way, hopefully to you, your generation, so that you know why what happened. And hopefully you will tell the stories, not only pass them on, also the stories of our times on to the next generation, so they know why we did what we did, and so on and so forth, so that the chain is maintained of our civilization. That's how a civilization stays alive. Yeah?
Hello, sir. So my question is about 18th century, late 18th, where there were not more than 1 lakh British officials or military officers in India, while the ratio of Indian soldiers was 6:1 when compared to the whites. And my question is, what could be the reason behind there wasn't any major resistance right at the beginning, where we were being exploited. Right when we were exploited, there wasn't any major experience, and I kind of feel that it's a late reaction where we started our resistance towards them. And what could be the reason behind?
So I will not agree that there was no resistance in the beginning. There was a lot of resistance and a lot of fighting in the beginning as well. I mean, I mentioned the polyguards themselves, late 18th and early 20th century. There was major fighting around this area.
No, the scale at which, how come it covers, no, it wasn't, the intensity at the beginning of the 19th century is not the same at the late 18th. Why didn't we placate it at the right when it was a small thing?
First of all, I don't entirely agree with you that there wasn't intensity, in the sense that the Maratha wars, for example, who were the prominent power in India in the late 18th century? It were the Marathas. And the Marathas fought 3 major wars against the British, which were very bloody, in which, tens of thousands of people died. There were other revolts as well. For example, in Bengal, there was the Sannyasi revolt. There were a whole bunch of tribal revolts that also happened against the British, and so on and so forth. And they were brutally crushed. Now, what I think is the point you are trying to make is, how did such a small group of people manage to crush? So it is not so much about whether there was resistance or not. There was plenty of resistance, and the battles were bloody. There were major also economic warfare in terms of large-scale famines and so on, some of which were almost deliberately created through forced cultivation of opium and indigo and so on. So many such things happened. The question is, how did such a small group of people manage to dominate such a large group of people? And in this story, which is a longer story, but one important aspect of it is the role played by collaborators and traitors. The role of collaborators and traitors is a very important and interesting story, which is usually not told because it is considered somewhat impolite. And it is because after India became independent, it is very interesting that this collaborator class was not evicted from our political office and intellectual life. Instead, the collaborator class actually benefited from the leaving of the British. So rather than the people who fought for independence, it was this group that benefited the most. Why? Because once independence happened, one branch of the Congress party, which was the Nehruvian branch of the Congress party, it captured power. And what it did is, first of all, it pushed out all the other branches of the Congress. Remember, the Congress party was a big tent, and it had many branches in it. The Nehruvians, first of all, kicked out all other branches of the Congress and dominated the Congress itself. But it also systematically pushed out the revolutionaries as well from the narrative. So the revolutionaries at independence had a problem. They were leaderless, because most of their top leaders, whether it's Netaji, Rashbihari, Sachin Sanyal, Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, all of them were dead. Or in the case of Netaji, maybe missing, depends on what you think about it. But they weren't around to provide leadership to the revolutionaries. So what happens is that the Nehruvians very systematically pushed them out of the narrative. The soldiers of the Indian National Army were not taken back into the army of independent India. They would not even be given the status of freedom fighters for many decades till much later. It's only in 2021 that for the first time soldiers of the Indian National Army were taken on the Republic Day parade. Just 2 years ago. The sailors of the Royal Indian Navy who had gone on revolt were not taken back into the Navy either. They were not even treated as freedom fighters, again till many decades later. And the revolutionaries themselves, of course, do remember, came from particularly Punjab and Bengal. In both cases, they faced partition. So what happened is, many revolutionaries who had fought passionately for Indian independence suddenly found that they became independent, but they had lost their homes. So became homeless in India. And the Maharashtrian Brahmins, particularly who had been at the forefront in Maharashtra, after Gandhi's assassination by a Maharashtrian Brahmin, they were also faced a lot of persecution. In fact, there were massive riots against Maharashtrian Brahmins in which hundreds of them were killed and the properties were burned down and so on. To this day, nobody talks about this. So the the groups that fought for Indian independence actually were pushed out of the narrative completely. They were pushed out of the history books as well. You may go to Kala Pani or cellular jail. Do remember that what you see today is just two wings of it. Almost all of it was actually almost demolished, so that the memory of that cellular jail would be demolished. It's only at the last minute it was stopped and it's been turned into the little bit that is there. The two wings that survived were turned into a national monument. Similarly, many monuments to the revolutionaries were systematically and deliberately removed. Many of the historians of the time who wrote about the revolutionaries, like R.C. Majumdar and so on, they were removed from the curriculum, removed from the conversation, so that only one stream of the freedom struggles was essentially left in the textbooks, which is the movement that you hear about, which is the non-violent movement. Meanwhile, what happens is that with the revolutionaries and other rival groups within the Congress having been pushed out, who is it that the Nehruvians reach out to provide sort of numbers in order to rule India? They reach out to those who had collaborated with the British. So it is the collaborators who remain in power. So for example, all the British officials who had, the Indian officials who had worked for the British, who in many cases were the people who had carried out the atrocities, they actually got promoted, because as the British left, the higher echelons of our government got emptied out, and many of these people got promoted. So same thing happened in every aspect of Indian life. So the intellectuals of post-independence India are not the ones who fought for India's independence. It was mostly those who had actually collaborated with the British. So naturally, they wrote the history in a particular way, and they edited it out in a particular way. So to go back to your original question, the point is that always remember that the British were able to rule over India because a class of Indians did collaborate with them. And after independence, it is they who were the main beneficiaries of independence and not those who had fought for Indian independence. This is one of the sad facts of Indian history, but that's what it is.
Hari Om, Sanjeev Sanyal ji. I would like to ask one question. For gaining independence, Indian struggle, what's your opinion? Which factor plays an important role? Is it the path of ahimsa or is it the path of revolution? Which factor plays its important role?
So the way I would argue is that you cannot separate the two out, because they were two sides of the same coin. Today what has happened is that the way you tell the story is only one side of the story is told and the other is not told. I'm trying to reset the balance. I'm not trying to say that only the revolutionary path was the only movement. I'm saying there was another movement, you have to remember them. And the revolutionaries, incidentally, were very important even within the Congress. You have to remember this, that Netaji Subhash Bose was able to win an election for president inside the Congress in 1938 against the Gandhians. So even within the Congress, the revolutionaries were a very strong faction. And this sort of friction between the two needs to be understood, even if you want to understand how the Gandhian movement and others or the British were all responding to various things. Because in some ways they were responding to what the revolutionaries were doing. For example, I talked about the Rowlatt Act. Now the Rowlatt Act can only be understood if you understood that what the Ghaddarite revolutionaries were doing. So I think it is important you understand that history is made up of many different ingredients. And to separate out any one of them is now impossible to do, because they were all feeding upon each other. If you read about, for example, the history of the 1900s, you will read about the friction between what is called now the extremist faction and the moderate faction, the Naram Dal, Garam Dal. Now, you have to understand that even there, it is interesting that this friction within the Congress, how it plays out, because those who are now called the extremist faction were basically the revolutionaries. In fact, one of the key members of this faction was Aurobindo Ghosh, the founder of the Anushilan Samiti and the revolutionary movement. And it is also interesting, the names that we use for these two factions to this day is also interesting. Because you see, you get the impression that the extremists were extremists because they were asked, why were they called extremists? Because they were asking for full freedom. The moderates, you get the impression, were reasonable chaps. Why? Because they were not trying to push for freedom, they were actually asking for crumbs from the table of the colonial rulers. So consequently, you know immediately who are the people who coined these terms. If you see it from the perspective of Sri Aurobindo, what is the terms he used for this faction? He called his own group the nationalists and the other group the loyalists. So you see, there are many perspectives of history. My point here is to show you that there are many perspectives. It's not only that one perspective. And my point is not to say that the peaceful struggle, political struggle was not of importance. It is of importance. But there is another story to be told, which is important. And that movement was not a small movement. Hopefully I gave you a flavor of what it is. But in fact, I have summarized it to a very narrow amount. This group, the revolutionaries, had links to many groups. They had links to tribals. They had links to peasant movements. They had links to the trade union movement. All these kinds of movements were coming out, like Lala Lajpat Rai. Lala Lajpat Rai was very close to the revolutionaries. He was also in the Congress, and he was also the founder, interestingly, of ITAC. So I think, is there any more questions? Because I'll take one more question and then then you are all free. So one more question. Yes, there is a gentleman there. If you can get oh, there's somebody here as well. Okay, I'll take two questions in one shot and then answer them. So the lady here and the gentleman there.
Hari Om sir, you mentioned about many revolutionaries and revolutionary movements. What do you think about women's situation during those revolutionary movements and their contributions to those revolutionary movements?
Okay, that's one question. I'll take the second question and answer them together. So while the mic goes up, let me answer. So there were actually the revolutionaries had several women in their ranks. So it's not the case that it was a purely male movement. Most of the leaders were, of course, male, but there were people like Bhikaji Kama, for example, who was a very important person living in Paris. There was Beena Das, who carried out an assassination attempt on the governor of Bengal in Calcutta University in 1933 or thereabouts. There is Durga Bhavi, who helped Bhagat Singh escape from Lahore after the killing of Saunders. So there are lots of women in the story in multiple roles. So you will read the book, you will find quite a few of them. Yes, there is a question up there.
Since we don't know much about Rin Mutiny and much more important events like in the revolution part, is it the government's duty or the common people's duty to carry the legacy forward towards the next generation, sir?
Well, it's everybody's job, not just the government. One of the things is, I'm of course a government official, but today I'm not here as a government official, I'm here as a writer. To tell you a story, I'm doing my little bit as a writer to do this, but the government also is trying to do this. As you may know, that very recently, right in the middle of Delhi on Kartavya Marg, there is a big statue of Netaji that has been installed. And I don't know how familiar you are with Delhi, but if you see Republic Day Parade, you will see that he now stands at one end of that Kartavya Marg, what used to be called Rajpath. So if you see where it stands, effectively what has happened is that every day when Republic Day Parade happens in Delhi, the march past is done essentially to Netaji because he's at the end of it taking a salute. Similarly, many other attempts have been made across the country to remember forgotten heroes. For example, Birsa Munda, who had been almost forgotten, has been brought back. Many of the sites relating to the INA, for example, in Manipur are being revived. I believe there was an event today also to remember the polygars, if I'm not mentioned. Is that the case? Something like that happened today? No, not today. Okay. But there was some event related, or not today, or in the next few days. There was something you told me about. Maybe I made a mistake. So a statue has been put up. So governments, both at the central level and at the state level, they are putting up. So we are putting up an effort to remember. But you see, you can put up whatever memory you want. You can have a statue in the middle of the city. But if people do not know who this person was, what did he do, then it's just a statue lying there. Once a year, somebody will go and put a mala, and that will be the end of the matter. So in the end, the most important place where the memory of these heroes have to be kept alive is in the hearts of the next generation. And that is what I'm trying to do. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening. I deem it as honor to propose a vote of thanks for today's event. On behalf of everyone here, I thank Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Economic Advisor to our Honorable Prime Minister of India. He presented the pre-independent events, and he has completely picturized the whole event in a beautiful way. I really thankful to you, sir. I thank our beloved Chairman and Madam Chairman for inviting Mr. Sanyal to be here with us today and giving this wonderful discussion about the pre-independent movement. I thank Mr. Abhinav. I thank all the invitees and members of the management and members of the Chamber of Commerce and general public. And I thank all the heads of institutions and students, those who are gathered in large numbers, and they really did not know what is it. And because of his because of his narrative, we all came to know what really had happened before our independence. So I'm really thankful to you, sir. I am thankful to each and every one of you for making this moment a great success. Thank you very much.